The conversation command. How to make people lean in, listen harder, and feel you before you finish speaking. Introduction. Why they tune out. You are not being ignored because you have nothing to say. You are being ignored because the signal you are sending before you open your mouth is telling the room, before your first word lands, before your argument is made, before your idea has a chance, that it can afford to drift. This is not a harsh judgment. It is a neurological fact, and once you understand it, the entire game changes. Here is what actually happens in the first seconds of any conversation, meeting, pitch, or difficult exchange. The other person's nervous system, before their conscious mind has processed a single word, has already begun reading you. It is scanning for threat or safety, chaos or calm, authority or uncertainty. It is checking your pace, your tone, your posture, the speed of your breath, the steadiness of your eye contact, the specific quality of your presence in the room. It is doing this in milliseconds. It is doing this automatically. And it is doing this before you have said anything worth listening to. The brain processes approximately 11 million bits of information per second. It consciously processes about 40. The other 10,999,960 are running below the surface, reading your signal, calibrating the room's response, deciding before any argument is evaluated whether the person speaking is someone worth following. Most people spend enormous energy on the 40 bits. The words, the argument, the data, the preparation. They rehearse what they are going to say and give almost no attention to what they are already communicating before the first sentence completes. This book is about the 10 million. Somewhere in the last few years, you have been in a room where someone walked in and the room changed. Not because they announced themselves, not because they said something immediately clever or commanding, because something about their presence, the pace at which they moved, the silence they were comfortable sitting inside, the specific quality of calm that surrounded them like a temperature change, made the room recalibrate. People turned. Conversations shortened. Attention oriented. Not because anyone decided to pay attention, because the signal that person was broadcasting made attention the nervous system's automatic response. You have also been in rooms where the opposite happened, where someone spoke louder and was heard less, where someone had the best argument in the building and was the least persuasive person in it, where effort and outcome had almost no relationship to each other, where the harder the push, the more the room contracted. If you have ever been the second person, and most of us have been the second person far more often than we would like, the explanation you gave yourself was probably some version of "I need to be more confident," or "they just don't get it," or "the room was already against me." These explanations are not wrong. They are just not specific enough to change anything. The specific explanation is this: the room was already responding to a signal you did not know you were sending. This book is not about becoming someone else. It is not a personality overhaul, a charisma transplant, or a collection of manipulation techniques dressed up as self-improvement. The people who walk into rooms and make them change are not, in most cases, naturally different from you. They are not born with a special frequency. They have learned, usually through accumulated experience rather than deliberate instruction, how to manage the signal they emit, how to regulate their own nervous system well enough that the people around them begin, automatically and without realizing it, to regulate in response. That process has a name. It has a mechanism. It has been documented across decades of neuroscience, behavioral psychology, and communication research. And it can be learned, specifically, practically, in the specific situations where it matters most, faster than most people believe. The research in this book is real. The tactics work. But neither the research nor the tactics are the point. The point is the shift that happens when you stop thinking about communication as the management of words and start thinking about it as the management of signal, the complete, pre-verbal, physiological, embodied broadcast that you are transmitting every time you enter a room, open your mouth, send a message, or sit across from someone who needs to trust you. When that shift happens, everything that follows becomes different. Not harder, not softer, more precise. The effort moves from the surface. the choosing of words, the rehearsing of arguments, the performing of confidence, to the source. And the source, once it is regulated, does something no amount of word choosing can do. It makes the room lean in before you speak. What this book is not. It is not a guide to manipulation. The tactics in these chapters can be used manipulatively. Most communication tools can. But the framework underneath them is not about control in the predatory sense. It is about clarity, presence, and the specific, ethical use of influence that happens when you communicate with genuine intention rather than anxious performance. The difference matters. The reader will feel it by the final chapter. It is not a book about becoming louder. Loudness is the amateur's solution to the signal problem. Every chapter in this book is, in some sense, about doing less. Less forcing, less filling, less performing, and allowing the specific, practiced quality of genuine presence to do what noise never can, hold attention without demanding it. It is not a book for a specific profession or personality type. The science does not discriminate between introverts and extroverts, executives and employees, salespeople and therapists, founders and teachers. The signal operates the same way in every room. The tactics translate across every context. The reader will identify their own points of highest leverage before the first chapter closes. What this book is: 10 chapters, each one built around a specific, documented mechanism of human communication. Each one ending with a practice, a specific, concrete, immediately applicable behavior that changes the signal before the next conversation begins. You do not need to read it in order, though the chapters build on each other in a way that rewards the reader who does. You do not need to implement everything at once. 3 of the 10 tactics, applied consistently, will change how rooms respond to you faster than all 10 applied sporadically. What you need to bring is the specific, honest willingness to stop explaining your communication failures as personality limitations. I'm just not a natural speaker. I was never good in meetings. That kind of confidence isn't really me. And start treating them as signal problems. Specific, diagnosable, correctable signal problems. Because that is what they are. And once you know that, the following 10 chapters are not inspiration. They are the repair manual. The room is already reading you. Chapter 1 shows you exactly what it sees. Chapter 1. The room responds first. Before you speak, the room has already voted. Not consciously, not deliberately, not with any malice or fairness or evaluation of your actual worth as a communicator. The room has voted the way rooms always vote. Automatically, physiologically, in the specific neurological language of nervous systems reading other nervous systems for safety, threat, and signals worth tracking. You did not get a chance to make your case first. Nobody does. The case is made by the signal, and the signal precedes the words by a margin that is, in neurological terms, enormous. By the time your opening sentence has completed, the people in the room have already decided, below the level of conscious thought, whether you are someone whose subsequent sentences are worth the energy of full attention. This is not pessimism. It is the most useful fact in this book. Because once you understand what the room is actually responding to, you stop trying to fix the wrong thing. The mirror in the room. In the 1990s, a team of neuroscientists at the University of Parma made an accidental discovery that changed the way researchers understood human social behavior. They were studying motor neurons in macaque monkeys, specifically, the neurons that fired when a monkey reached for a peanut. Routine work. Established territory. Then a researcher walked into the lab, reached for something on a desk, and the recording equipment registered something unexpected. The monkey's motor neurons fired. The monkey had not moved. It had watched someone else move, and its brain had responded as if it had performed the action itself. The neurons responsible became known as mirror neurons. Subsequent decades of research extended the finding to humans, documented the system's operation across emotions and intentions as well as actions, and established a mechanism that accounts for something every person with significant social experience has observed but rarely had the language to describe: the specific, immediate, apparently involuntary way that human beings absorb and reflect the emotional and physical states of the people around them. When you walk into a room of people who are tense, your nervous system tenses. Not because you assessed the situation and decided tension was appropriate, because the mirror system processed the room's signal and began generating a matching state before your conscious mind had finished scanning the space. The same mechanism runs in reverse. When you walk into a room carrying a specific quality of calm, groundedness, or settled authority, the mirror systems of the people present begin, without choice or decision, to generate states that correspond to what they are reading. This is not metaphor. This is documented neurobiology, and it is the foundation of everything this book teaches. The 200 millisecond window. The mirror system operates at approximately 200 milliseconds, less than the blink of an eye. In that window, before your first sentence is complete, the brains of the people you are addressing have already begun the process of mirroring your state, calibrating their response to your signal, and establishing the neurological conditions under which they will either engage fully or manage you with the portion of attention that is easiest to spare. 200 milliseconds is faster than conscious thought. It is faster than evaluation. It is faster than the social override that allows people to suppress their immediate responses in professional contexts. The override comes later. The mirror fires first. This means that the most sophisticated argument you have ever constructed, the most carefully prepared presentation, the most important point you have ever needed to make, all of it enters a room that has already been prepared by your signal to receive it either openly or defensively, attentively or distractedly, with the specific quality of engagement that corresponds not to the quality of your content, but to the quality of your presence in the moment before your content began. The argument is downstream of the signal, always, without exception. What the signal contains. The signal is not a single thing. It is a broadcast, a composite of physical, vocal, behavioral, and temporal cues that the room's mirror systems are reading simultaneously and integrating into a single felt response. Its primary components. Pace, the speed at which you move, enter, settle, and begin. Rushed pace signals urgency, anxiety, or low status. The person who needs to get their words out before the room's permission expires. Measured pace signals something different. The person who does not need the room's permission because their presence is not conditional on the room's approval. Tone. Not the content of what you say, but the emotional frequency underneath it. Tone carries the signal's most direct emotional information. The specific quality that tells the room whether the person speaking is regulated or dysregulated, certain or uncertain, present or performing presence. Stillness. The capacity to remain physically and emotionally still, not rigidly, not suppressed, but genuinely settled, is among the most powerful signal components available because it is among the rarest. Most people, under social pressure, leak. They fill silence, move unnecessarily, adjust, qualify, append. The person who can be still under pressure while remaining fully present is broadcasting a signal the room has almost never encountered and does not know how to ignore. Orientation, where your attention is directed, whether you are genuinely present to the person in front of you or partially elsewhere, managing an internal monologue, rehearsing the next point, monitoring the room's reaction, is legible to the mirror system in ways that verbal performance cannot override. Genuine attention produces a felt quality of being seen that people respond to with an opening they cannot fully explain. Breath, the most direct regulator of the room's physiological state that most communicators never think about. Shallow, high breathing produces a vocal quality that the room's nervous systems read as stress. Full, low breathing produces the specific vocal stability that the next chapter on entrainment will describe in detail. The breath is not decoration. It is the signal's engine. What the room does with what it reads. Having read your signal in the first 200 milliseconds, the room's collective nervous system does one of three things. It opens. The signal registered as grounded, present, and worth orienting toward. Attention increases. Posture adjusts slightly forward. The quality of listening changes from passive processing to active engagement. The room has, without deciding to, given you its best attention. It closes. The signal registered as anxious, uncertain, performed, or threatening. A subtle contraction occurs. Attention becomes more managed, available in the portion that politeness requires, but not in the full, leaning in quality that genuine engagement produces. The room is present in body and partial in mind, and no amount of compelling content will fully recover the attention the signal lost before the first sentence completed. It waits. The signal was ambiguous, not strong enough to open the room, not off-putting enough to close it. The room is holding its assessment, waiting for subsequent evidence. This is the most common state and the most recoverable. It is also the state most people are producing most of the time, because most people have never been taught that the signal is a manageable variable rather than a fixed output of their personality. The entire practical project of this book lives in that third category. The room that is waiting can be opened. The signal that is currently ambiguous can be made specific. The broadcast that you are currently sending without awareness or intention can be adjusted, practiced, and eventually made reliable, not as a performance, but as a genuine expression of the specific quality of presence that the best communicators in any room are producing. That quality is not a mystery. It is not talent. It is not the exclusive province of the naturally charismatic or the professionally trained. It is the output of a set of specific, learnable, immediately practicable behaviors that this book will give you, one chapter at a time, beginning with the most foundational. The anchor. The practice. Read before you broadcast. Before your next significant conversation, a meeting, a pitch, a negotiation, a difficult exchange, take 60 seconds to do one thing. Read the room's current signal before you add yours to it. Walk in slightly before you need to speak. Notice the pace of the existing conversation. Notice the emotional temperature. Notice whether people are leaning in or leaning back, whether the energy is tight or loose, whether the room's current signal is one that your natural broadcast will match or amplify or counter. You are not intervening yet. You are developing the most important habit the rest of this book requires, the ability to read the signal before you send one, so that when you do begin speaking, you are not adding noise to the room's existing state. You are shifting it. This is what the best communicators in every room are doing while everyone else is preparing their opening line. They are reading the room's current nervous system and deciding, with the specific awareness this book is building, what signal will move it in the direction the conversation requires. You cannot manage what you have not noticed. The 60-second room read is the beginning of noticing. Do it before the next conversation. Then do it again. The practice is not dramatic. It does not require anyone to know you are doing it. It will change what you broadcast, and therefore what the room reflects back to you, faster than any technique that follows. Why smart people get ignored in meetings. The smartest person in the room is often the least heard. Here's the neuroscience of why, and how to fix it in under 10 seconds. Neuroscientists discovered something called mirror neurons. They fire in 200 milliseconds before your first word lands. What that means, the room doesn't respond to your argument first. It responds to your signal, your pace, your tone, your stillness, your breath. If that signal says anxious or uncertain, the room closes before your point gets a chance. The fix isn't talking louder. It's slowing down your entry. Walk in like you have time. Settle before you speak. Let the room come to you. 3 things to change before your next meeting. Slow your pace by 20%. Take 1 full breath before speaking, and hold your first pause for 3 full seconds after you begin. The room's nervous system will recalibrate toward you before you've made a single argument. Chapter 2 is where it gets more specific, the anchor. The single first cue that tells the room who you are before you've said a word. Link in bio if you want the full book. Comment below. Does the smartest person in your room always get heard? Usually not. Here's why. The room doesn't need a better argument. It needs a better signal. Chapter 2 is where you build it. Chapter 2, the anchor. Every conversation has a first cue. Not the first word. The first cue, the initial, often nonverbal piece of information the room receives about the kind of person you are and the kind of conversation this is going to be. It arrives before your argument, before your opening line, before your name is fully registered. It arrives in the quality of your entry, your pace, your posture, your first breath. That cue is the anchor, and it governs almost everything that follows. The anchor is not what you say first. It is the specific, felt quality of who is here that precedes the first sentence and sets the frame inside which every subsequent word is received. A strong anchor tells the room, this person knows what they are doing. This conversation is worth the full investment of attention. The signal here is stable enough to orient toward. A weak anchor tells the room something different, not necessarily a negative thing, but an ambiguous one. Not sure yet. Hold it partial attention. We'll see. Most people never think about their anchor. They think about their opening line. They rehearse their first argument, their key points, their clever way into the subject. They pour enormous energy into what comes third, fourth, and fifth, and almost no energy into the cue that determines whether what comes third, fourth, and fifth gets a fair hearing. This chapter is about changing that. How the anchor works. In 2006, psychologists at Princeton University published a study that became one of the most cited findings in social psychology. Nalini Ambady and her colleagues demonstrated that observers watching a 10-second silent video clip of a person could predict, with statistically significant accuracy, ratings that other observers gave that person after a much longer exposure. The judgments formed in 10 seconds were not significantly less accurate than judgments formed after minutes of observation. The mechanism behind this is what cognitive scientists call thin slicing, the brain's ability to extract reliable patterns from minimal exposure. The brain does not need large amounts of data to form a strong impression. It needs a few high-quality cues from which to extrapolate, and those cues are disproportionately weighted toward the beginning, toward the anchor, because the brain, as an energy conservation system, would rather build a model early and update it if necessary than withhold judgment until full information is available. This means the anchor is not just the first impression in the popular sense, the social nicety we invoke to remind people to dress well and smile firmly. It is the foundational data point from which the brain builds its entire model of who you are in this conversation. The model gets updated as more information arrives, but it is built from the anchor. And a model built on a weak foundation requires significant subsequent evidence to revise. A model built on a strong anchor is self-reinforcing. Every subsequent strong signal is consistent with the model. Every moment of genuine competence, clarity, or presence confirms what the anchor already established. The room does not experience surprise at the quality of your thinking. It experiences confirmation. This is the specific asymmetry between weak anchor and strong anchor communicators in identical situations. The strong anchor communicator's quality is amplified by the room's expectations. The weak anchor communicator's quality is filtered through the room's lower initial model. Same content, different reception. The 4 anchor components. The anchor is not one thing. It is a composite of 4 simultaneous signals, all of which are legible to the room's mirror systems in the first 10 seconds of any encounter. Entry pace, the speed at which you arrive, move to your position, and settle before speaking. Entry pace is the anchor's first cue and one of its most powerful. The person who enters quickly moves to their seat with the specific energy of someone who is not yet fully present, and begins speaking before they have fully settled sends an anchor of managed scarcity. I am giving you time I don't quite have. The person who enters with measured pace, who moves as if the space belongs to them in the comfortable sense rather than the territorial one, who settles completely before beginning, sends an anchor of abundance. I have what I need to be fully here. Entry pace is immediately adjustable. It requires no new skill. It requires only the deliberate slowing of the specific behavior that anxiety makes fast and comfort makes measured. First sound. The anchor's second component is the first sound you make. Not necessarily the first word, but the first vocalization. A cleared throat, an audible breath, a hesitation sound. So. Before the first word completes. These are anchor cues. They tell the room's nervous system that the speaker is self-monitoring before speaking, which reads as uncertainty even when the content that follows is entirely certain. The first sound should be the first word. Full, unhurried, and launched from the low, settled position of a vocal instrument that has had time to calibrate before it began. This is a practice, not a talent. It requires the specific habit of waiting one full breath after you are settled before producing any sound, including the hesitation sounds that anxiety generates automatically and certainty does not require. Physical position, where you place yourself and how you occupy that place, is the anchor's most visible component. The person who takes their space, not aggressively, not expansively for its own sake, but fully, sends a different anchor than the person who occupies their space with the contracted posture of someone who is not sure they have permission to be exactly where they are. The rib cage open or closed. The shoulders back or rounded. The feet planted or restless. These are all legible cues, processed by the room's mirror system in the same 200 millisecond window, contributing to the same initial model. Physical position is the most immediately transformable anchor component because it is purely behavioral. It requires no emotional state change, only a physical adjustment that, crucially, produces the emotional state change as a downstream effect. Open the rib cage and the breath deepens. Deepen the breath and the cortisol drops. Lower the cortisol and the vocal quality changes. The physical adjustment is the starting point, not the outcome. The first silence, the most powerful anchor component and the one almost nobody uses deliberately. The first silence is the pause between your full arrival in the room and the beginning of your speech. Most people fill this gap with a throat clear, with an opener, with a connecting phrase that gets them from settled to speaking without the specific discomfort of being present in the room without yet performing. The communicator who does not fill the gap, who is simply, completely, uncomfortably present in the room's attention for 2 to 4 seconds before speaking, sends an anchor that the room has almost never encountered. It says, I do not need to begin yet. I am not performing. I am here. 2 to 4 seconds of genuine, settled silence before speaking is among the most counterintuitive and most immediately effective communication changes available. It feels exposing. It reads as authority. The gap between those two experiences is the gap between what performing confidence feels like and what genuine presence produces. The weak anchor pattern. There is a specific, recognizable pattern of anchor behavior that highly intelligent, well-prepared, genuinely capable communicators default to when they are under pressure, and that systematically undermines the reception of everything that follows. It goes like this. Entry is slightly fast, because the internal state is already running at a higher tempo than the room requires. The move to position is accompanied by the small, incidental behaviors of a person still arriving mentally, adjusting materials, glancing at the audience, running a quick internal check of readiness. The first sound is a hesitation vocalization. So, right, okay. That signals the warm-up is still in progress. The body has not fully settled before the voice begins. The content that follows may be excellent. The preparation may be thorough. The argument may be the strongest in the room. But it enters a room that the anchor has already told to hold at partial attention, not because the person is unworthy of full attention, but because the signal said not fully ready before the content said fully prepared. The room responds to the signal. It always responds to the signal first. The strong anchor in practice. Here is the same scenario with a deliberate anchor. Entry is measured, not theatrical, not slow for effect, but genuinely unhurried. The move to position is clean and complete. The person arrives at their spot and stops moving before they begin anything else. Materials are already organized. Phone is away. Attention is externally directed before the first syllable. There is a pause, visible, deliberate, not filled, of 2 to 3 seconds in which the person is simply present. Then the first word, full, launched from a calibrated instrument, without a preceding hesitation sound. The room has not heard the argument yet. It has not evaluated the content. But the anchor has told the mirror systems of everyone present. This is someone whose signal warrants full attention. The model is built on a strong foundation. The content that follows gets the reception it deserves. This is not magic. It is not charisma. It is a set of specific, learnable, immediately practicable behaviors that collectively produce the signal the room's nervous systems are wired to orient toward. The practice, the 10-second anchor audit. For your next 3 significant conversations, a meeting, a client call, a presentation, a difficult conversation, run a deliberate anchor audit before you begin. Ask for questions. Is my entry pace measured or managed scarcity? If you are rushing in, stop 10 feet earlier than you need to. Walk the last 10 feet at half your current speed. Feel the difference in what the room receives. What is my first sound? Practice producing your first word, not an opener, not a preamble, the actual first content word, without a preceding vocalization. The proposal, not so, the proposal. Record yourself once. You will be surprised how often the hesitation sounds appear. Is my physical position complete before I begin? Settle fully, body at rest, materials placed, attention external, before your first word. The settling should be visible and unhurried. Did I allow the first silence? 2 seconds minimum. Settle. Look at the room. Begin. These 4 adjustments, made simultaneously, produce an anchor that is categorically different from the one you are currently sending by default. You do not need to change your personality. You need to change the first 10 seconds. The first 10 seconds change what the next 10 minutes can accomplish. The 10-second anchor that makes rooms pay attention. There's a 10-second window before you speak that determines whether the room gives you full attention or partial attention. Most people waste it. Here's exactly what to do instead. Psychologists at Princeton found that people form stable judgments from less than 10 seconds of observation, and those early judgments shape everything that follows. It's called thin slicing. The brain builds a model from your first cues, then filters everything else through it. The 4 cues it reads first: your entry pace, your first sound, your physical position, and your first silence. Most people enter too fast, start with or so, are still settling when they begin speaking, and fill every available gap with noise. The fix is 4 specific adjustments. Slow your entry by 20%, drop the hesitation opener, settle completely before your first word, and hold 2 seconds of silence before you start. That's it. The room will orient toward you before you've made a single argument. Try this in your next meeting and comment what happened. The most uncomfortable part? The 2 seconds of silence. Do it anyway. That discomfort is your signal that it's working. The anchor is the first promise you make to the room. Chapter 3 is about what happens the moment after, how to open a conversation in a way the brain literally cannot ignore. Chapter 3. Novelty gets the door open. You have 3 seconds to make the brain decide to stay. Not 3 seconds to impress, convince, or win. 3 seconds to trigger the specific neurological response that makes continued attention feel involuntary rather than chosen. 3 seconds to produce the one stimulus the human brain is biologically incapable of ignoring. Something it has not seen before. The brain is not loyal to logic. Here is a fact that undermines most communication training in a single sentence. The brain does not prioritize important information. It prioritizes unexpected information. Not because it is irrational, because it is efficient. A brain that only attended to novel stimuli survived better than a brain that gave equal attention to everything. Because in a world where most of the environment is stable and familiar, the thing that has changed is the thing most likely to be dangerous, useful, or significant. The brain's attention system is not built for modern conversation. It is built for an ancient environment where the rustle in the grass that was different from yesterday's rustle was the one worth tracking. That architecture did not update when humans moved indoors. It runs the same algorithm in the boardroom that it ran on the savannah. What is new here? What has changed? What does not match the pattern I was expecting? That is the stimulus that receives the brain's priority processing. That is what gets the door open. The formal name for this response is the orienting reflex, first documented by the Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov and subsequently studied by neurologists and communication researchers across 8 decades of converging evidence. The orienting reflex is the brain's automatic, involuntary reorientation toward unexpected stimuli. It produces a measurable physiological response: pupil dilation, skin conductance change, a brief interruption of the default mode network, and a significant increase in the brain's allocation of processing resources to the novel stimulus. It is, in practical terms, the experience of your attention snapping towards something before you decided to pay attention to it. You have felt this. You are sitting in a meeting that has been running at a familiar tempo. The expected words, the predictable structure, the content that confirms what you already knew was coming, and your attention is partially elsewhere. Then someone says something unexpected, a statistic that contradicts the assumption, a question that has no obvious answer, a phrase that breaks the rhythm of every preceding phrase. Your attention arrives before you invite it. That snap is the orienting reflex, and it can be produced deliberately in the first 3 seconds of any conversation, meeting, pitch, or opening line, if you understand what triggers it and what does not. What triggers it and what does not? Most people open conversations with a version of the expected. Good morning, thanks for having me. I wanted to talk today about. The meeting opener that sounds like every preceding meeting opener. The email subject line that confirms the email's content before the email is read. The presentation slide that repeats the title of the presentation. The pitch that begins with the company's founding story. None of these are wrong. They are simply invisible, processed by the brain's pattern recognition system as familiar, consistent with expectation, low priority, and filed accordingly. The attention they receive is the minimum the social context requires, not the full, leaning in, involuntary engagement that the orienting reflex produces. The orienting reflex is triggered by 3 specific types of stimulus. Unexpected information, a statistic, fact, or claim that contradicts the audience's existing model of the subject. Not a controversial opinion, a piece of genuinely surprising data that the brain has no established pattern for. The average person is interrupted within 11 seconds of beginning to speak. That is unexpected. The brain did not have a confident prior about that number. The gap between expectation and information triggers the orienting response. The attention arrives. Pattern interruption, a break in the structure, rhythm, or expected sequence of the communication that signals something different is happening here. This can be a deliberate pause in an otherwise flowing presentation, a physical stillness that follows a period of movement, a change in vocal tempo, a single short sentence following several long ones. The brain reads the pattern break as a signal that the environment has changed and allocates attention to assess what changed and why. An open loop, a question, half-completed thought, or implied promise that the brain cannot close without continued attention. There is one thing almost every high-stakes conversation has in common, and it is not what most people assume. The brain, once presented with an open loop, experiences a mild but measurable compulsion toward its resolution. The curiosity gap, the space between what is known and what has been implied, is uncomfortable enough that attention stays engaged in order to close it. All 3 can be produced in the opening 3 seconds of any conversation. All 3 are learnable, and all 3 share a single underlying mechanism. They give the brain something it did not already have, in a way that makes having it feel urgent. The opening architecture. There is a specific architecture to openings that consistently produce the orienting reflex, and a specific architecture to openings that consistently do not. The opening that does not trigger the reflex follows the establishing pattern: context, then content. I will tell you who I am. Then I will tell you what we are here to discuss. Then I will begin the substance. The brain processes the establishing sequence as scene setting, important, perhaps, for orientation, but not novel. Attention is managed, not commanded. The opening that triggers the reflex follows the disrupting pattern: unexpected element first, context second. Lead with the surprising fact, the bold claim, the specific question, the counterintuitive statement, and establish context after the brain's attention has already arrived. The brain is already engaged before it knows why, and the why, when it arrives, reinforces the engagement rather than creating it. This is a structural inversion. It requires the communicator to resist the natural impulse toward preparation and context, to trust that the disruptive opening will hold the room long enough for the context to land, and to place the highest impact material at the position of maximum neurological leverage, the first moment of full attention. The question is not what do I need to say in this conversation before you open it. The question is what is the most unexpected, pattern-breaking, loop-opening first sentence I can produce that is also genuinely true? That question reframes the preparation entirely. It moves the energy from what should I cover to what does the room not know yet that it will immediately want to know. Novelty versus gimmick. There is a version of this principle that degrades quickly, the opening that is unexpected for its own sake rather than in genuine service of the content. The shocking statistic that has no relationship to the actual subject. The bold claim that cannot be supported. The pattern break that breaks the pattern and then has nothing to say in the silence it created. The orienting reflex delivers attention. It does not deliver trust. The room snaps toward the novel stimulus and then, within the next 5 to 10 seconds, evaluates whether the disruption was earned. If the unexpected opening leads somewhere genuine, the attention converts to engagement. If it was a trick, the room closes harder than it would have from a conventional opening, because the mirror system has been played and the brain does not forgive that quickly. The standard is not surprising for its own sake. It is genuinely unexpected but immediately relevant. The opening that the room did not see coming and that, once delivered, makes the content that follows feel necessary. The practice: 3 openings, 1 real one. Before your next significant conversation, pitch, or meeting, write 3 possible openings. The first is the one you would naturally default to, the established, contextual, expected opener you would produce without this chapter's framework. The second is an unexpected fact, statistic, or claim from within your subject that the room is unlikely to already know, something genuinely surprising that is also genuinely relevant. The third is a question, open-ended, genuinely answerable, and specific enough that the brain cannot close it without hearing what comes next. Read all 3. Identify which one produces the clearest, most involuntary pull toward what comes after. Use that one. Do not open with the first. The first was built before you understood the orienting reflex. The second and third were built to trigger it. The room your first opener received is not the room the third opener will produce. Write the 3 openings once. Produce the third 10 times. By the 10th time, writing unexpected openings first will be the default, and the establishing opener will feel, as it should, like a missed opportunity. Why your openings are losing the room immediately. You have 3 seconds to make someone's brain decide to keep listening. Most people spend those 3 seconds on context. The brain doesn't care about context. Here's what it actually responds to. There's a reflex called the orienting response, discovered by Pavlov, confirmed by decades of neuroscience, that fires automatically whenever the brain encounters something unexpected. Pupil dilation, attention snap, full processing power redirected. It's involuntary. You can trigger it deliberately. 3 things that produce it: an unexpected fact, a pattern break, or an open loop, a half-finished thought the brain can't close without hearing more. The average presentation starts with context. Context is invisible to this reflex. Instead, lead with the thing the room doesn't know yet. Not a gimmick, A genuine, relevant, immediately surprising first sentence that makes what follows feel necessary. Test it once. Write your normal opener. Then write the most unexpected true thing you could say about your subject. Use the second one. The room you get back will be different. Comment your best surprising opener below. I'll tell you if it triggers the reflex or kills it. Chapter 4 is where we talk about the thing that makes everything you say land as smarter, more credible, and more trustworthy, and it has nothing to do with your vocabulary. Novelty gets the door open. Chapter 4 is about what you say once you're inside, and why clarity is the highest authority signal most people never use. Chapter 4. Clarity is authority. There is a specific kind of intelligence the room cannot see. It lives inside the person who knows their subject so completely, so thoroughly, so three-dimensionally, that they could explain it in 17 different ways to 17 different audiences. It is real intelligence, earned intelligence, the kind that took years to build and deserves to be recognized. The room does not recognize it. The room recognizes something simpler, faster, and more immediately legible: the ability to make the complex feel effortless. Not because the complexity was avoided, but because the person communicating it has done the invisible work of translation, has taken the difficult thing and found the version of it that lands clearly, completely, and without friction in the mind of the person receiving it. That ability has a name in the research. It is called the simplicity anchor, and it is the single most misunderstood signal of intelligence available in human communication, because most people believe complexity signals competence, when the research shows, with remarkable consistency, that the opposite is true. The intelligence inversion. In a series of studies at the University of Munich, researchers presented subjects with information delivered in two ways: highly technical, complex language, and clear, accessible language covering identical content. Subjects rated the clear communicators as significantly smarter, more competent, and more trustworthy than the complex communicators. Not slightly smarter, significantly smarter. This finding, replicated across subsequent studies and consistent with the broader literature on cognitive fluency, points to a mechanism that is counterintuitive but well-established. When the brain finds a message easy to process, it attributes the ease to the speaker's competence rather than to the simplicity of the message itself. Easy to understand reads, as this person has mastered the material. Difficult to understand reads, not as this person knows more than I do, but as this person either does not understand their subject well enough to explain it simply, or is obscuring something behind the complexity. The researcher Daniel Oppenheimer titled a paper on this phenomenon, "Consequences of Erudite Vernacular Utilized Irrespective of Necessity," a deliberately complex title for a paper demonstrating that unnecessarily complex language makes speakers appear less intelligent. The irony was the point. The title was designed to be experienced as what the paper was documenting: the specific, immediate sense that something is being hidden or inflated behind language that could have been simpler. The intelligence inversion is this: using complex language to sound smart makes you sound like you're trying to sound smart. Clarity makes you sound like you already are. What complexity actually signals? In high-stakes communication contexts, meetings, pitches, negotiations, presentations, difficult conversations, complex language does not signal expertise. It signals one of three things, and the room will read which one within seconds. Insecurity. The communicator who defaults to technical jargon, elaborate qualification, and multi-clause sentences in situations where plain language would serve is often running a hidden program. If I surround my idea with enough complexity, the gaps in it will be harder to find. The room's mirror system reads this accurately. It is not fooled by the complexity. It reads the anxiety underneath it and responds with the appropriate reduction and trust. Unfinished thinking. Clarity requires that you have thought something all the way through, that you have arrived at the version of the idea that has been refined to its essential structure. Complex language is often the output of thinking that stopped one step before clarity, that produced the complete picture but did not do the translation work of finding the simple version. The room experiences this as the communicator not quite knowing what they mean, because at the level of expression, they don't. Not yet. Audience disrespect. The communicator who speaks above their audience's framework, not to challenge them productively, but to establish status through inaccessibility, sends a signal the room finds immediately alienating. Not because complexity offends, but because the room senses, accurately, that the complexity is not in service of the idea. It is in service of the communicator's self-image. The room does not forgive that either. In all three cases, the reaction is the same. The room reduces its investment. Not dramatically, social protocol prevents the visible withdrawal. But internally, partially, the room steps back from the communicator who made understanding a labor rather than a gift. What clarity actually requires? Clarity is not simplification in the sense of reduction. It is not the dumbing down of complex ideas for audiences assumed to be incapable of complexity. It is the specific, effortful, skilled work of finding the version of a complex idea that transfers completely, that arrives in the mind of the listener without distortion, without the friction of unnecessary processing, without the tax of decoding language that could have been plainer. It requires three things. Compression, the ability to identify the essential structure of an idea, the core claim, the single most important implication, the one thing that, if understood, makes everything else make sense, and lead with that rather than with the scaffolding that produced it. Most communicators lead with scaffolding. They show the work before the result. The clear communicator leads with the result and offers the work for those who want it. Concrete language. Abstract language describes categories. Concrete language describes instances. We need to improve operational efficiency describes a category. We need fewer steps between the customer's order and their delivery describes an instance. The brain processes instances faster, retains them longer, and trusts them more, because they can be visualized, and the brain confirms truth more readily through visualization than through abstraction. Wherever you are currently using an abstract term, there is a concrete version of it. The work of clarity is finding the concrete version and using it instead. The one-sentence test. Before any significant communication, a meeting opener, a pitch, an email, an argument, ask, can I say the essential thing in one sentence? Not one paragraph. One sentence. If you cannot, the thinking is not yet complete. The idea has not been refined to its essential structure. The sentence will come when the thinking reaches clarity. Until then, you are transmitting the work of thinking rather than the output of thought, and the room will experience that difference as confusion rather than complexity. Talking in tweets. There is a communicator you almost certainly know, in your industry, your field, your peer group, whose sentences get repeated. Not because they are the most expert person in the room, not because their ideas are the most original, because they have the specific, practiced ability to compress genuine insight into a form that is short enough to be portable and precise enough to be worth repeating. Naval Ravikant became one of the most followed thinkers of his generation, not primarily through books, courses, or formal content, but through a continuous output of compressed, specific, genuinely original one-liners that people could carry with them and produce in conversations as if they had thought of them independently. The ideas were not simple. The expression of them was. This is not a celebrity phenomenon. It operates at every level of every organization. The person in the meeting whose phrases get repeated in the hallway afterward. The manager whose feedback lands and stays. The founder whose pitch gets quoted in the investor's notes. These are not always the most technically sophisticated communicators. They are the ones who have learned, deliberately or through accumulated experience, to talk in tweets. A tweet-length line is not a dumbed-down version of a complex idea. It is the complex idea fully processed, taken all the way through the refinement that stops at the essential, the portable, the repeatable. It is the version of the idea that the listener can carry out of the room and reproduce accurately for someone who wasn't there. If someone can reproduce your idea accurately for someone who wasn't there, you have communicated. If they cannot, you have transmitted information in the approximate shape of an idea, without completing the transfer. The one-liner is not the shortcut. It is the destination. The high signal-to-noise practice. There is a specific habit that most professional communicators have trained themselves out of, but that destroys clarity faster than any other single behavior: adding words that add no information. What I'm trying to say is, remove it. Say the thing. That's a really great question. Remove it. Answer the question. I think what we need to consider here is the possibility that remove it. Say what you think. So basically what's happening is remove it. Say what's happening. These are noise words. They occupy the space between the speaker's last thought and next thought, fill the silence that compression requires, and signal to the room that the sentence it is about to receive has not yet been fully formed. The room reads this correctly. The noise words are the sound of a communicator who has not yet done the compression work, who is thinking out loud rather than delivering thought. The high-signal communicator says more with less, not because they have less to say, because they have done the invisible work of translation, the refinement that removes everything the idea does not require, and the room receives the result as authority. The practice, the compression audit. Take the most important communication you have in the next 7 days: a meeting, a pitch, a proposal, an email, a conversation, and run 3 compression passes on the key message. Pass 1. Write the message as you would naturally write it. All the context, all the scaffolding, all the qualification. Pass 2. Identify the single most important sentence in what you wrote. Remove everything that does not serve that sentence. Pass 3. Take the single most important sentence and compress it to its essential structure. Remove every word that does not carry information the listener needs. What remains is the core message. Deliver the core message first. Offer the scaffolding only to the listener who asks for it. Do this 3 times, and the compression process begins to run earlier, at the thinking stage rather than the revision stage. The communicator who compresses early produces clarity that sounds effortless because the effort happened before the room arrived, in the invisible work of refinement that the room will experience only as its output, the specific, rare, immediately recognizable authority of a person who always seems to know exactly what they mean. Why trying to sound smart makes you sound dumb? Using complex words doesn't make you sound smarter. Science says it makes you sound less smart. Here's why, and what to do instead. A University of Munich study found that people rated simple communicators as significantly more intelligent and trustworthy than complex ones, covering identical content. The reason, when your message is easy to process, the brain attributes the ease to your mastery. When it's hard, it assumes you're either hiding something or haven't fully thought it through. Complex language signals 3 things: insecurity, unfinished thinking, or disrespect for the audience. None of those are what you're going for. The fix is compression, finding the one sentence that carries the full weight of the idea and leading with that. Before your next important conversation, ask, can I say the essential thing in 1 sentence? If not, the thinking isn't done yet. Keep compressing until it is. The goal isn't to sound simple. It's to be so clear that the room has no choice but to understand you. That is authority. Comment your most compressed one-liner on your area of expertise below. Let's see who can do it in under 10 words. Clarity is the highest authority signal in any room. Chapter 5 is where authority becomes engagement, and how a single well-placed question does more work than 10 minutes of perfect argument. Chapter 5. Questions move people. The most powerful move in any conversation is not a statement. It is not a perfectly compressed one-liner, a surprising fact, or a well-anchored entry. It is a question, the right question, asked at the right moment, in the specific way that makes the brain's chemistry change before the other person has formed an answer. Not any question. Most questions in most conversations are social machinery, the polite scaffolding of exchange that nobody finds memorable and everybody performs. How are you? What do you think? Does that make sense? These are questions in grammatical form and noise in communicative function. They ask without actually opening anything. They invite response without creating the specific neurological state that makes response feel necessary rather than optional. The questions this chapter is about do something different. They move people, chemically, physiologically, attentionally, in a direction they would not have moved without the question. They open loops the brain needs to close. They create the specific, documented, neurologically measurable state in which a person is more engaged, more present, more connected to the conversation, and more likely to act on what follows. They are, in the most precise sense available, the most underused tool in human communication, and almost nobody uses them deliberately. What a question does to the brain. Carnegie Mellon researchers studying curiosity and cognitive engagement found something that reframes the entire function of questions in communication. When a person encounters a question they do not immediately know the answer to, their brain releases dopamine. Not figuratively, chemically. The same neurotransmitter associated with reward, motivation, and the drive to seek. The chemical that makes the next bite feel necessary before the last one is finished is released in response to a question that creates genuine information gap. The brain, encountering a question it cannot immediately close, experiences a mild but measurable compulsion toward resolution. It becomes more alert, more engaged, more oriented toward the source of the question. This is the curiosity loop, the specific neurological state of a brain that is in pursuit rather than in receipt. The brain in receipt mode processes information passively. It receives, filters, retains what fits the existing model, discards what doesn't, and allocates the minimum attention the social context requires. The brain in pursuit mode does something categorically different. It actively searches, connects, generates, and engages with full processing resources because the open loop has made engagement feel rewarding rather than obligatory. The question that opens the curiosity loop does not make the listener work harder. It makes the listener want to engage, which is a completely different experience and produces a completely different quality of attention. The question that does not open the loop, the closed question, the rhetorical question, the question that telegraphs its expected answer, produces no dopamine, no curiosity loop, and no shift in the quality of the room's engagement. It is noise. The practical question is, what distinguishes the questions that open the loop from the questions that don't? 3 types of questions that move people. The reframe question. This is the question that shifts the frame of the conversation by asking the other person to consider their situation from an angle they have not yet occupied. It does not argue with their current frame. It offers a different one and asks if they want to look from there. What would make this feel like a relief instead of a risk? That question, from the transcript that opened this book's writing, worked not because it was clever, but because it was genuinely reframing. The seller was in a risk frame. He was managing his fear of exposure. The question did not address the fear directly, which would have escalated the defensiveness, or bypass it, which would have felt dismissive. It asked him to step into a different frame entirely, the one where the transaction had already resolved, and the feeling was relief. The dopamine response was triggered by the gap between where his thinking was and where the question pointed. His nervous system moved before his mind had formed an answer. This is the reframe question's specific mechanism. It invites the brain to occupy a state it is not currently in, and the gap between the current state and the invited state is the curiosity loop. The brain begins moving toward resolution before the conscious response is constructed. The surgical question. This is the question that targets the single most important thing in the conversation, the variable that, if understood, changes everything else, and asks about that specifically rather than about the general subject. It signals that the asker has been paying close enough attention to identify what actually matters, which produces the specific, rare experience of being truly understood rather than generally engaged with. What is the one thing about this situation that you haven't said yet? If you could change one decision from the last 6 months, which one? What are you most afraid this conversation will conclude? These questions are surgical because they bypass the presenting conversation, the one the other person has been having, internally and externally, in the rehearsed, socially managed form, and ask about the real one. The brain's response to being asked the real question, when it expects the presenting one, is the orienting reflex combined with the curiosity loop. This person sees something I didn't know was visible. The attention that follows is not polite. It is genuine. The permission question. This is the question that grants the other person authority over the conversation's direction, that makes them a participant rather than an audience, and in doing so, transfers the dopamine response of engagement from you to them. When people feel they have chosen to engage rather than been required to, their neurological investment in the conversation increases significantly. Can I test an idea on you? Do you want to hear something I've been thinking about that I haven't said to anyone yet? Is this a good moment to talk about the thing we've been not talking about? The permission question does three things simultaneously. It creates novelty, unexpected structure, opens a loop, what is the idea, the thing, the unsaid conversation, and signals respect for the other person's attention as a resource that deserves to be asked for rather than assumed. The brain receiving a permission question experiences the specific, flattering recognition of being treated as someone whose engagement is worth requesting. People follow the communicator who asked permission more readily than the one who assumed it. Every time. The question is close. There is a specific moment in most high-stakes conversations where the speaker reaches the end of their argument and does the thing that loses them the most. Opens the floor with an empty question. So, what do you think? Does that make sense? Any questions? These are the conversation equivalents of an anchor that doesn't anchor. They land in the silence after the argument and produce the specific state of an open room with no direction. A group of people who have just processed significant content and are now looking at each other to see who will go first. The empty close is not neutral. It reads as uncertainty. It tells the room that the speaker has delivered their content and is now waiting to find out whether it was enough, which is the exact signal of low-status communication. The person who performs and then waits for the verdict. The question as close is different. It is specific, forward-moving, and designed to pull the room into the next action rather than leave it in the assessment of the current one. Based on what we've covered, what's the one thing you'd want to resolve before we move forward? If you were going to push back on any part of this, where would it be? What would need to be true for this to feel like the right decision? These questions do not ask the room to evaluate. They ask the room to participate, to bring its thinking, its resistance, its genuine engagement to bear on the next thing rather than the last thing. The distinction is the difference between a closed argument waiting for judgment and an open collaboration seeking momentum. The question that changes the room's chemistry. There is a specific type of question, the one the other person was not expecting and cannot answer reflexively, that produces a visible, physical shift in the conversation's quality. The body language changes. The tone changes. The specific quality of the other person's attention changes from managed to genuine. You have produced this shift before, probably without knowing you produced it deliberately. You asked something and the room went quiet in a different way than silence usually falls. Not the silence of discomfort or confusion, but the silence of a brain genuinely thinking. That silence is the curiosity loop in operation. The dopamine has been released. The brain is in pursuit rather than in receipt. The question landed in the gap between what the person already knew and what they suddenly needed to know, and the gap is now driving the conversation forward without you having to push it. This is the most efficient form of communication available. The question that makes the other person's brain do the work of engagement, so that you are not producing engagement through effort, but through the specific, practice skill of asking the thing that opens the loop the room needs to close. The practice, the question audit. For 1 week, after every significant conversation, run a single question audit. Did I ask a question that moved the conversation, or did I ask questions that filled the silence? Not a judgment, a diagnostic. The distinction between the question that moves and the question that fills is usually felt in hindsight. The filling question produces a polite answer and a return to the existing state. The moving question produces something different in the room, a shift, a pause, a change in the quality of the other person's engagement. Track which type you produced more of. Then, before your next significant conversation, prepare one question from each of the three categories: a reframe question, a surgical question, and a permission question. You will not necessarily use all three. Having them prepared means they are available, and available questions, when the moment arrives for them, are used. Unprepared questions, in the moments that require them, are replaced by the empty close. The room that receives the right question moves. The room that receives the empty close waits. Prepare the question. Let the room move. One question that chemically changes any conversation. There's a type of question that releases dopamine in the listener's brain before they've formed an answer. Here's how to use it in any conversation, meeting, or negotiation. Carnegie Mellon researchers found that open-ended questions trigger a dopamine release in the brain, the same chemical that drives motivation and engagement. The brain enters pursuit mode instead of receipt mode. Full attention, active engagement, genuine presence, from a single question. There are three types of questions that produce this. The reframe question, which moves the person into a frame they weren't in. What would make this feel like a relief instead of a risk? The surgical question, which targets the one thing they haven't said yet. And the permission question, which grants them authority over the conversation. Can I test an idea on you? Any of the three, asked at the right moment, shifts the room's chemistry before you've made a single argument. Stop closing with "what do you think?" Start closing with "what's the one thing you'd want to resolve before we move forward?" The room you get back will be completely different. Comment the best question you've ever been asked, the one that made you actually think before answering. I'll tell you which of the three types it was. Chapter 6 is where we take the conversation's hardest moment, the argument, the negotiation, the uncomfortable exchange, and show you the three-move system that wins it without raising your voice. Questions are not the polite scaffolding of conversation. They are its engine. Chapter 6 gives you the tactical system for when the engine needs to run under the highest possible pressure. Chapter 6. The 3, 2, 1 reset. Every conversation has a moment where it tips. Not breaks. Tips. The specific instant where the exchange crosses the threshold from productive to defended, from collaborative to competitive, from a conversation about the subject to a conversation about who wins the conversation. You have felt it. The temperature shifts. The pace accelerates. The other person stops receiving information and starts building a response. You stop listening and start loading. Most people have no system for this moment. They have instincts: fight, defend, escalate, withdraw, all of which are the nervous system's ancient responses to perceived threat, and none of which are optimized for the specific modern problem of a high-stakes conversation that has begun to tip and needs to be reset without either person losing face in the resetting. This chapter is the system. It is called the 3, 2, 1 reset. 3 seconds, 2 points, 1 question, and it is the most immediately applicable tactical framework in this book. Not because it is complicated, because it is specific. It addresses the precise neurological conditions of a tipping conversation with the precise interventions those conditions require, in a sequence that is short enough to remember under pressure and effective enough to change the conversation's direction before the tip becomes a break. Why conversations tip? A conversation tips not because the subject became more difficult. Subjects do not change their difficulty mid-conversation. A conversation tips because one or both participants shifted from regulated to dysregulated, from the cognitive state in which full brain processing is available to the narrowed, threat response state, in which the brain's resources are redirected toward defense, and the quality of thinking available to the conversation drops significantly. The neuroscientist Daniel Siegel describes this state as flipping the lid, the specific condition in which the prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational assessment, nuanced communication, and considered response, is effectively bypassed by the amygdala's threat response. The person who has flipped the lid is not choosing to be unreasonable. Their brain has temporarily redirected its processing resources in a way that makes considered response neurologically unavailable. The problem in most tipping conversations is that both participants tip in sequence. One person's escalation triggers the mirror system of the other, whose escalation mirrors back, whose escalation mirrors back again, and the conversation moves, in a matter of seconds, from productive exchange to mutual defense with neither party choosing the transition or having a system to reverse it. The 3-2-1 reset is a system to reverse it, unilaterally, without requiring the other person to cooperate, agree, or even be aware that a reset is happening. Step 1. The 3-second pause. When you feel the conversation tip, when your own signal moves from regulated to reactive, when the next sentence is loading before the current one has finished, stop. Not dramatically, not as a performance of composure. Stop speaking for 3 seconds. This pause does something specific in the brain that nothing else does as quickly. It activates the anterior cingulate cortex, the region responsible for error detection, attention regulation, and the override of automatic responses. Neuroscientists have found that even a brief, deliberate pause activates this region and begins the process of restoring prefrontal engagement. Begins, in Siegel's terms, the process of flipping the lid back. 3 seconds is the minimum effective duration. Less than 3 seconds is not a pause. It is a stutter that the mirror systems read as hesitation rather than regulation. 3 to 5 seconds is the optimal range for most conversation contexts. More than 5 seconds begins to read as disengagement rather than reset. The discomfort of the 3-second pause is, at first, significant. The conversation has been moving at an elevated pace. Stopping feels like exposure. The instinct is to fill the silence immediately with a qualifier, a connector, a resumption of the loading sentence. Resist this. The discomfort is the pause working. The mirror systems of the people in the room are registering the change in your signal, from escalating to settled, and beginning, automatically, to mirror it. The pause is not passive. It is the most active possible intervention available in the first 3 seconds of a tipping conversation. It does more work than any sentence you could have produced in those 3 seconds, because it changes the conversation's physiological state rather than adding to its content. Hold it. 3 seconds minimum. Then step 2. Step 2. 2 points only. After the pause, you have something you need to say. The argument is loaded. The response is ready. The evidence is available. Give only 2 points. Not 3. Not 5. Not the full argument with all its supporting evidence. 2 points, delivered with the specific brevity that the brain's current state requires. The cognitive science behind this is called dual-track working memory, the brain's capacity to simultaneously process verbal and visual information. Under normal conditions, the brain can hold more. Under the conditions of a tipping conversation, elevated cortisol, reduced prefrontal engagement, the specific cognitive load of a defensive state, the effective working memory capacity drops. The brain can reliably track 2 parallel points. Beyond 2, processing load exceeds capacity and the additional points are not integrated. They are experienced as noise, as the other person saying more than they need to, which reads as pressure rather than communication. 2 points does something else. It signals that you have chosen what matters. Most defensive communication is characterized by the accumulation of evidence, the piling of point upon point in the implicit argument that more evidence will eventually overcome resistance. It does not. Resistance is not a processing problem. It is a physiological state. More information does not resolve a physiological state. Fewer, better chosen, more precisely delivered points do, because they allow the brain to track them fully, which reduces the cognitive load of defense and creates the small opening in which regulation can begin. The 2 points should be your strongest, not your most comprehensive, not your most emotionally charged, not your most recent. Your 2 strongest, the 2 that, if genuinely received, Make the most important parts of your case without requiring the rest. Deliver them with the same measured pace the pause established. Do not allow the pace to accelerate back to the pre-pause tempo. The signal should remain settled through both points, because the mirror systems are still reading, and the signal they read through your delivery carries more weight than the content of the points themselves. Then, immediately after the second point, Step 3. Step 3. One question. In with a question, not an open floor, not a what do you think or a does that make sense. A specific, forward-moving question that requires the other person to shift from defense to engagement, from the physiological state of accumulating counterargument to the physiological state of thinking about the next thing. The question interrupts the default mode network, the brain's automatic processing loop that, in a tipping conversation, has been running the argument construction program on repeat. Questions force an exit from the default mode network. The brain cannot construct a new argument and process a genuine question simultaneously. The question wins. The argument construction pauses. A brief window of genuine engagement opens. The question should be one of the types from Chapter 5, reframe, surgical, or permission, and it should be genuinely curious rather than rhetorical. The rhetorical question in a tipping conversation reads as another argument wearing question-shaped clothing. The room knows the difference, and the mirror system responds accordingly. What would need to change for this to feel workable to you? Which part of what I said felt most off? If you were in my position, what would you do differently? These questions do not concede the argument. They do not signal weakness or uncertainty. They signal something rarer and more powerful in the context of a tipping conversation, genuine interest in the other person's reality. The brain receiving that signal, in the specific physiological state of a defensive conversation, experiences it as a pattern break significant enough to trigger the orienting reflex. The question lands. The loop opens. The conversation resets. The full sequence in practice. Here is the 3, 2, 1 reset in a real context. You are in a meeting. The discussion has been escalating for 10 minutes. The other person has just said something that is factually incorrect and publicly undermines your position. Your loaded response is ready. The instinct is to deploy it immediately and with force. Instead, 3 seconds. You pause, visibly, with settled body language and a steady signal. The room notices. The other person notices. The mirror systems begin registering the change. 2 points. There are 2 things I want to respond to. The first is the data. The numbers from last quarter tell a different story, and I can show you those. The second is the decision timeline. The assumption that we have until December is incorrect, and that changes the analysis significantly. Clean, specific, unhurried. 2 points only. 1 question. If the timeline is shorter than you thought, which part of this changes most for you? The question moves the conversation forward. It does not ask the other person to concede the factual point. It asks them to engage with the implication of a corrected fact. The brain, shifted by the question from defense to engagement, begins processing the implication rather than defending the original position. The conversation has been reset without either person explicitly acknowledging that it tipped. This is the system's specific advantage. It operates below the threshold of social management. Nobody in the room needs to name what happened. The conversation simply changes direction, with a quality of reset that participants experience but rarely identify explicitly. Why it works under pressure. The 3, 2, 1 reset's reliability under pressure comes from the specific sequencing of its interventions relative to the neurological conditions of a tipping conversation. The pause addresses the physiological state before addressing the content, which is the only order in which the content can be received. Addressing content while the physiological state remains escalated does not change the content's reception. It adds to the noise. The pause changes the state that receives the content. The content then lands differently because the brain receiving it is different. The 2-point limit addresses the cognitive load problem, ensures that the content, having been received by a more regulated brain, is actually processed rather than filtered out by the working memory limitation of a defensive state. The question addresses the continuation problem, ensures that the reset produces momentum rather than simply pausing the escalation. Without the question, the pause and the 2 points produce a brief, regulated moment that the next stimulus can tip again. The question redirects the conversation's direction entirely, so that the next stimulus arrives in a different context than the one that produced the tip. Pause, points, question, in that order, every time. The practice, the pre-tip preparation. The 3, 2, 1 reset works best when it has been rehearsed before the conversation that requires it, not because it is complicated, but because under the cognitive load of a tipping conversation, systems that have not been practiced are not available. Before any high-stakes conversation where tension is likely, prepare explicitly. Write the 2 strongest points you want to make if the conversation tips, not your entire argument, your 2 strongest points. Write 1 question for each of the 3 types from Chapter 5 that could move the conversation forward from the most likely tipping point. Know your pause threshold, the specific signal, internal or external, that tells you the conversation is tipping and the reset needs to begin. For most people, this is a physical signal, the jaw tightening, the breath shallowing, the specific quality of readiness that the body produces before the loaded response deploys. When the threshold signal arrives, the system is already loaded. Pause. 2 points. 1 question. The conversation that was about to break bends instead, and the person in the room who bent it, who moved from escalation to reset without anyone having to ask, is the person who commands the room's highest attention from that moment forward. Not because they won the argument, because they regulated it. And in any room, in any conversation, in any negotiation or meeting or difficult exchange, the person who can regulate the room while everyone else is tipping is the person the room follows. The 3-step system that wins difficult conversations without raising your voice. Most people lose difficult conversations not because their argument was wrong, but because their nervous system tipped before their argument landed. Here's the 3-step reset that fixes it in under 30 seconds. When a conversation tips, your prefrontal cortex, the part that thinks clearly, gets bypassed by your amygdala. You're not thinking anymore. You're defending. The 3, 2, 1 reset interrupts that cycle. Step 1. Pause 3 seconds. Neuroscientists found this activates the anterior cingulate cortex, the brain's error detection and attention regulation system. The pause literally changes your brain state before your next sentence. Step 2. Give only 2 points. Not 5. Not your full argument. 2. The defensive brain can track 2 things. Beyond that, it experiences everything as noise and pressure. Make your 2 strongest points, delivered calmly, at the pace the pause established. Step 3. End with 1 specific question. Questions interrupt the brain's default argument construction loop. The other person cannot build their next rebuttal and process a genuine question simultaneously. The question wins. The conversation resets. Pause. 2 points. 1 question. Every difficult conversation, without exception. Try this in the next conversation that starts to tip. Comment what happened. Most people report the other person's tone changes within 30 seconds. Chapter 7 is where we go deeper into the signal, your voice, and why it is literally a remote control for other people's physiology. The 3, 2, 1 reset is not a de-escalation technique. It is a regulation system for your nervous system first and the room second. Chapter 7 is where you discover the most direct physiological tool you carry into every conversation, your voice. Chapter 7. Voice changes the room. You have been thinking about your voice wrong. Most people think about their voice the way they think about their wardrobe, as a presentational choice, a surface-level signal of professionalism or personality, something to be adjusted when the occasion demands a different register. Speak more formally in meetings. Speak more warmly with clients. Project more when the room is large. All of that is true. None of it is the point. Your voice is not a presentational tool. It is a physiological one. It does not just carry your words to the listener's ear. It changes the listener's body, their heart rate, their breath rate, their cortisol level, their felt sense of safety or threat, in real time, below the level of conscious processing, before the content of what you said has been fully received. This is not a metaphor. It is documented neuroscience. And it means that every time you speak, you are doing something far more consequential than communicating information. You are regulating or dysregulating the biological state of every person within earshot. The question is not whether you are doing this. The question is whether you are doing it deliberately. Vocal entrainment, the most important communication phenomenon you have never heard of. In 2014, researchers at University College London published a finding that reframes the entire practical project of communication training. They demonstrated that humans subconsciously synchronize their heartbeats to the rhythm of a speaker's voice, a phenomenon they called vocal entrainment. The mechanism is not mysterious. The autonomic nervous system, which regulates heart rate among its other functions, is sensitive to auditory rhythms in the environment. This sensitivity evolved in the context of social regulation, the specific, ancient need for groups of humans to synchronize their physiological states for cooperative activity. The heartbeat sync that happens in an audience listening to music, in a group moving together, in the specific calm that descends on a room when someone with a genuinely settled voice begins to speak. These are all expressions of the same evolved mechanism. What the UCL research established is that this mechanism operates specifically and measurably in response to individual human voices in ordinary conversational contexts. When you speak in a rushed, unstable, high-tempo vocal pattern, the heart rates of the people listening begin to increase. Their breath shallows. Their cortisol rises. Their felt sense of the conversation shifts toward urgency, pressure, or mild threat. Not because of what you said, but because of the physiological signal your voice delivered before the words were processed. When you speak in a slow, steady, rhythmically consistent pattern, the opposite occurs. Heart rates stabilize or decrease. Breath deepens. Cortisol drops. The felt sense of the conversation shifts toward safety, authority, and trust, again, before the content has been evaluated. Your voice is a remote control for other people's physiology. Every conversation you have is a physiological event as much as a linguistic one. The question is not whether you want to regulate the room. You are already regulating it. The question is what signal your instrument is currently sending and whether that signal is the one the room requires. The three vocal variables that matter most. There are many dimensions of vocal production that communication coaches address: resonance, pitch, articulation, volume, projection. All of these are real. None of them are as immediately consequential for room regulation as the three variables that the entrainment research identifies as the primary drivers of the listener's physiological response. Tempo. The speed at which you speak is the most powerful vocal variable available, and the one most directly affected by the internal state that conversation pressure produces. When your nervous system is regulated, your tempo is naturally measured. You have enough cognitive resource to generate the next thought before the current one is finished, which means the delivery can be unhurried. When your nervous system is dysregulated, tempo accelerates. The speech begins running slightly ahead of the thinking, which produces the specific quality of rushed delivery that the listener's mirror system reads as anxiety and mirrors back. Tempo control is therefore simultaneously a vocal skill and a regulation skill. You cannot maintain measured tempo while your nervous system is dysregulated. The two states are physiologically incompatible. This is why the pause from Chapter 6 is not just a tactical tool. It is a tempo reset, a deliberate interruption of the accelerating cycle that restores the specific physiological condition in which measured delivery is available. Depth. Vocal depth, the resonance of the voice in the chest rather than the throat or head, is the single most powerful authority signal the voice can produce and the one most directly connected to the breath. The chest voice is only available when the breath is full and low. The throat voice, the slightly constricted, higher, less resonant sound that most people produce under pressure, is the sound of a body that is breathing in its upper chest, which is the body's stress breathing pattern. The practical implication is that the voice deepens not through deliberate effort at the vocal level, but through deliberate change at the breath level. One full, low, diaphragmatic breath before speaking, the kind of breath that expands the lower ribs rather than just the upper chest, changes the vocal instrument's resonance before the first word is produced. This is the specific reason that the best speakers, the ones whose voices consistently project calm authority, seem to have more vocal resources available than other people. They are not physiologically different. They are breathing differently. The breath is available to anyone who practices producing it before speaking rather than during. Rhythm. The specific pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables, the natural cadence of sentences, the specific musicality of speech that the Princeton Processing Fluency research found to be associated with perceived truth. Rhythm is the vocal variable that the most influential communicators share regardless of their other differences. Naval Ravikant's voice is different from Barack Obama's, which is different from Brené Brown's. What they share is not a voice type. It is a rhythmic consistency, the specific quality of speech that moves between emphasis and ease in a pattern the brain finds effortless to track, which it attributes, automatically, to the authority of the speaker rather than the quality of the production. Rhythm is developed through the same practice that develops most physical skills, deliberate repetition with attention to the variable being trained. The most effective single practice for vocal rhythm is reading aloud, specifically, reading material that has strong natural rhythm, good prose, speeches, poetry, at the tempo you want to produce in conversation. 10 minutes per day of deliberate rhythmic reading produces measurable vocal rhythm improvement in 2 to 3 weeks. Not because the voice changes, but because the brain develops the motor pattern that produces consistent cadence automatically, so that it does not need to be constructed consciously during conversation. Rhythm makes ideas sound true. The Princeton Processing Fluency research introduced in Chapter 4's discussion of clarity produced a finding that belongs equally in this chapter. Statements that rhyme or follow a consistent rhythm are judged as more truthful than identical statements that do not. This is not about rhyming communication. The finding is not an instruction to speak in couplets. It is about the brain's relationship to rhythmic language. When a phrase moves with the specific ease of consistent rhythm, the brain processes it fluently, without friction, without the slight cognitive effort that irregular or clunky language requires. And because the brain attributes processing ease to the content rather than to the form, the rhythmic phrase feels true in a way the identical non-rhythmic phrase does not. You repeat what you don't repair. 8 words. Perfect rhythm. Before the meaning is processed, the rhythm has already produced the felt quality of wisdom, the sense that this is the kind of phrase that has always been true and is simply being correctly named. Patterns that are not addressed tend to recur in subsequent similar situations. Same idea. No rhythm. Processed as information rather than felt as truth. This is why the one-liners from Chapter 4 are not just about compression. They are about rhythm. The compressed idea, expressed in a rhythmic form, is not just more portable. It is more persuasive, more memorable, and more likely to be experienced as true before it is evaluated. The communicator who can speak in compressed, rhythmic language is doing something the listener's brain finds genuinely irresistible, producing content that feels true at the physiological level before it is assessed at the logical one. The yoga voice and the PE meeting. The transcript of this book emerged from offered 2 examples that illuminate the same principle from different angles. The yoga instructor speaks in a specific, drawn-out, rhythmically consistent pattern and in downward dog, and then we move into upward dog. That strikes most first-time participants as strange or artificial. It is neither. It is the deliberate application of the same mechanism the UCL researchers documented. A vocal rhythm designed to synchronize the listener's breathing and heart rate with the instructor's, producing the specific physiological state, slow, deep, regulated, in which the body can follow the physical instruction. The yoga instructor is not performing serenity. They are inducing it via the most direct physiological channel available before any instruction about how to feel has been given. The PE meeting, the one where a single person walked into a room of arguing people, pulled up a chair, sat quietly, and waited, is the same mechanism operating through stillness and temporal signal rather than voice. The signal in both cases is identical. I am regulated. My instrument is settled. The room can follow the signal I am producing or continue producing its own, but the signal I am producing is stable enough to wait. In both cases, the room followed, not because it was instructed to, because the mirror systems of the people in it received a regulated signal and began, automatically and below conscious choice, to produce a corresponding state. This is available to you, in any room, in any conversation, not through performance of calm, which the mirror system reads as performed and discounts accordingly, but through the genuine physiological regulation that your voice, your breath, your tempo, and your rhythm either produce or undermine in the people you speak to. The practice, the vocal calibration sequence. Before any high-stakes conversation, a presentation, a negotiation, a difficult exchange, a room that is going to read your signal in 200 milliseconds and decide what to give you, run the vocal calibration sequence. 30 seconds before you speak. One full diaphragmatic breath, not a deep sigh, a low, expanding breath that fills the lower ribs and pauses for 2 counts at the top before releasing slowly. This resets the breath instrument to its full resonant capacity. One test sentence. Before you enter or before you begin, produce one sentence at the tempo and depth you intend to use, not in your head, aloud. In the bathroom, in the hallway, in the 30 seconds before the call begins. The voice needs one production before the stakes arrive. Athletes warm up. Performers warm up. The voice that goes into a high-stakes room without any production that day is not at its calibrated best. One anchor phrase. A short phrase, personal, rhythmic, specific to you, that you have practiced producing at the tempo and depth the room requires. Not for the room to hear, for your nervous system to use as a regulation signal. The act of producing the anchor phrase at the calibrated tempo and depth creates a brief physiological state of settled delivery that persists into the first several sentences of the actual conversation. These 30 seconds of vocal preparation change the first 60 seconds of vocal delivery. The first 60 seconds of delivery sets the room's physiological state. The room's physiological state determines the quality of attention available to your content. 30 seconds of preparation for the quality of every minute that follows. Your voice is a remote control for other people's bodies. Researchers at University College London found that your voice changes other people's heart rates in real time before they've processed a single word. Here's how to use that deliberately. It's called vocal entrainment. When you speak rushed and stressed, listener heart rates increase. When you speak slow and steady, they decrease. You're not just communicating, you're physiologically regulating every person in the room. 3 variables drive this: tempo, depth, and rhythm. Tempo, slow down by 20% from your default speed, and the room's nervous system follows. Depth, one full diaphragmatic breath before you speak shifts your voice from throat to chest. That shift alone changes the room's perception of your authority. Rhythm, Princeton researchers found that rhythmic language is judged as more truthful than identical content without rhythm. The phrases that feel like wisdom? Almost always rhythmic. You repeat what you don't repair. Move slow to move fast. Before your next high-stakes conversation, one low breath, one test sentence, one anchor phrase. 30 seconds of preparation that changes every minute that follows. Record yourself speaking for 60 seconds, then listen back. Notice where your tempo rushes, where your voice goes thin, where the rhythm breaks. That gap between your recorded voice and your intended voice is the practice. Chapter 8 is where the voice meets the body. and why what you do with your hands before you speak changes what the room believes about what comes out of your mouth. Your voice is not decoration. It is the room's physiological thermostat. Chapter 8 gives you the rest of the instrument. The body that carries the voice signals before it speaks and changes what the room receives before a single word is produced. Chapter 8. Your body talks before you do. Before your voice reaches the room, your body already has. Not in the abstract sense of presence or energy, in the specific, documented, neurologically precise sense that the visual signal your body produces is processed by the room's mirror systems faster than the auditory signal your voice produces. The room sees you before it hears you. And what it sees, the specific configuration of your physical presence, the openness or closure of your posture, the visibility and movement of your hands, the specific quality of physical occupation that your body communicates before the first syllable, is the signal that frames everything your voice subsequently delivers. This is not about power poses. It is not about standing in a superhero position before a meeting to boost your testosterone. That research, popularized and subsequently largely discredited, was a misreading of a real mechanism at the level of application. The real mechanism is more specific, more durable, and more immediately useful than a pre-meeting ritual in the bathroom. It is about understanding that your body is producing a continuous, high-bandwidth signal that the room cannot choose not to receive, and that most people allow that signal to run on automatic, unexamined, from the default physical patterns that anxiety and modern sedentary posture have installed, rather than from the deliberate, calibrated physical production that every high-signal communicator manages, consciously or through long practice, in every room they enter. Gesture priming. Your hands help your brain think. In 2007, researchers at UC Berkeley published findings that overturned the common assumption about the relationship between gesture and speech. The common assumption, held by most people, including most communication coaches, was that gesture follows thought. You form an idea, you express it verbally, and your hands illustrate the expression. The UC Berkeley research found the opposite. Gesture precedes speech in the brain's production sequence. The hand movement begins before the verbal production that corresponds to it, which means the gesture is not illustrating the thought. The gesture is forming it. Your hands help your brain construct the idea that your voice then delivers. This is called gesture priming, the specific, documented mechanism by which physical movement activates the neural networks associated with the concept being expressed, making the verbal expression more precise, more fluent, and more cognitively accessible than it would be without the gesture. The practical implication is immediate. The communicator who speaks with active, open, expressive hands is not performing engagement. They are producing it, generating the specific neural activation that makes their own thinking clearer while simultaneously producing the visual signal that the room's mirror systems read as open, engaged, and trustworthy. The communicator with still, hidden, or dead hands is not just missing a presentational opportunity. They are depriving their own thinking of a cognitive tool and sending a physical signal that the room's ancient safety assessment systems read as concealment. The ancient signal of hidden hands. The human brain's assessment of hand visibility is not a social convention. It is an evolutionary legacy, the specific, hardwired threat detection response that developed in an environment where hidden hands meant potentially armed hands. Jan from HR is almost certainly not concealing a weapon. The brain does not care. The amygdala, which processes threat signals faster than conscious thought, responds to hidden hands with the same low-level alertness it responds to any concealment signal. And that alertness, mild as it is, creates the specific quality of guarded attention that is the opposite of the open, leaning-in engagement that effective communication requires. Hidden hands, in pockets, behind the back, tucked under the table, produce guardedness in the room. Dead hands, the limply hanging, uninvolved hands of a communicator who is physically present but physically disengaged, produce the specific, deflationary signal of a person who is not fully invested in the communication they are producing. Crossed arms produce the well-documented closed signal that the room reads as defensive, regardless of whether the communicator is cold, comfortable, or genuinely closed. Open hands, visible, active, oriented toward the listener, produce the opposite. The specific, ancient, still operative signal of I have nothing to hide. I am here for exchange. My intention is visible. The room's amygdala receives this signal before the prefrontal cortex processes the words, and the room opens fractionally in response. A fractional opening that, compounded across the full duration of a conversation, produces a categorically different quality of engagement than the guarded attention that hidden or dead hands generate. Hands visible, hands open, hands active before you speak. The rib cage and the dominance posture. Modern life has produced a specific, near-universal postural default that is physiologically costly and communicatively disastrous. The closed, forward-rounded posture of a person who has spent years oriented toward a screen. Shoulders rounded inward, head slightly forward, upper chest collapsed, rib cage compressed, breath restricted to the upper chest. The posture of absorption, of smallness, of a body that has adapted to a workspace that does not require physical presence and has forgotten the specific, physically produced signal of a person who is fully here. This posture does three things simultaneously, all of them detrimental to the signal you are trying to produce. It restricts breathing. The collapsed rib cage cannot expand fully, which means the diaphragmatic breath from Chapter 7 is physically unavailable until the posture is corrected. The voice that comes from a compressed rib cage is the throat voice. Higher, thinner, less resonant, less authoritative, regardless of the communicator's actual expertise or confidence. It elevates cortisol, the physiological research on posture and endocrine response, including the legitimate findings beneath the oversold power pose literature, consistently shows that closed, contracted postures produce elevated cortisol and reduced testosterone relative to open, expanded postures. This is real biology, not performance science. The body's postural configuration sends feedback to the endocrine system, and the endocrine system responds with a hormonal profile that corresponds to the posture's implied status. Closed posture produces the hormonal profile of low status. Open posture produces the hormonal profile of settled authority. It signals closure to the room. The mirror systems of the people across from a closed-postured communicator receive the visual signal of contracted presence and produce, automatically, a slightly more guarded response than they would produce to an open-postured communicator delivering identical content. The content is the same. The signal is different. The room responds to the signal. The correction is not complicated. Roll the shoulders back and down, not artificially squared, but genuinely back, out of the forward-rounded default. Allow the rib cage to open laterally, the ribs expanding outward with the breath rather than only the chest rising. Feel the specific change in the breath's quality that the open rib cage produces. Notice the change in the voice's resonance that follows the change in the breath. This is called the calm dominance posture, not the aggressive, puff chest performance of someone claiming space they are not entitled to, but the settled, open, fully present physical configuration of a person who is comfortable occupying their space because they have the genuine intention of using it well. It is available in 10 seconds. It changes the signal the room receives in the same 10 seconds. The body adjusted, the breath deepened, the voice descended, and the signal shifted, all from a postural correction that takes less time than most people spend adjusting their materials before a presentation. The convergence, when body, voice, and signal align. There is a specific, recognizable quality that the room experiences when someone's body, voice, and signal are all producing the same message simultaneously. The physical presence is open and settled. The hands are visible and expressive. The rib cage is open. The breath is full and low. The voice is resonant, measured, rhythmic. The pace is unhurried. The eye contact is genuine rather than performed. The overall signal reads to every mirror system in the room, as this person is completely here, not performing being here, not managing their appearance of being here, but genuinely, physiologically, communicatively present in a specific way that makes full engagement the room's natural response. This convergence is not a personality trait. It is not charisma in the mysterious, some people have it, some don't sense. It is the specific, learnable, practicable alignment of physical, vocal, and signal variables that every chapter in this book has been building toward, each one addressing a different component of the same integrated broadcast that the room reads before any argument is made as either worth following or worth managing. The communicators who produce this convergence consistently are not doing something fundamentally different from what you are doing. They are doing many small things: the entry pace, the anchor, the breath, the hands, the posture, the rhythm, that individually seem minor and collectively produce a signal that the room experiences as exceptional. None of those small things is beyond your immediate reach. All of them are practicable. Any three of them, applied consistently starting from the next conversation, will change the signal the room receives. Any 7 of them, applied with the deliberate practice this book describes, will change the room's response to you in a way that becomes self-reinforcing, because the room that gives better attention produces better conversations, which produces more practiced delivery, which produces a stronger signal, which produces better attention. The cycle runs in both directions. This chapter starts it running in the right one. The practice, the body audit. For 1 week, before every significant conversation, run a 30-second body audit. Hands, visible and open, or hidden, dead, or crossed. Correct before you begin. Shoulders, rolled back and down, or forward rounded in the screen default. Correct before you begin. Rib cage, open laterally with the breath, or compressed and shallow. Take 1 full lateral breath to open it before you begin. Feet, planted and still, or restless, shifting, crossing. Plant them, not rigidly, but groundedly, before you begin. Face, engaged and present, or managing an internal monologue. Direct your attention fully outward before you begin. 30 seconds. 5 checks. The body that enters the room after those 30 seconds produces a categorically different signal than the body that enters on default. The room will respond to the difference before you have said a word, because the room always responds first. And the room that has been read correctly, entered well, opened with novelty, addressed with clarity, engaged with questions, reset under pressure, regulated by voice, and now met with the full open signal of a body that is completely present. That room is not a room you need to convince. It is a room that is already leaning in. Why your body loses the room before you speak. UC Berkeley researchers found your hands help your brain form thoughts before the words come out. Here's what your body is communicating before you say a single word and how to change it. Your body produces a signal the room reads before your voice arrives. 3 things it reads immediately: your hands, your posture, and your rib cage. Hidden or dead hands. The brain's threat detection system reads concealment and guards. Open, visible, active hands signal exchange. The room opens. Rounded shoulders and compressed chest. You're restricting your breath, elevating your cortisol, and sending a closed signal that the room mirrors back as guarded attention. Roll the shoulders back. Open the rib cage laterally. 1 full breath. The voice drops. The signal shifts. The room follows. Before your next significant conversation, 30 seconds. Check your hands, visible and open. Check your shoulders, back and down. Check your rib cage, open with the breath. Check your feet, planted. Check your attention, fully outward. That's the body audit. 30 seconds that change the signal the room receives before you've said a word. Record yourself on video in your next meeting. Just watch it back with the sound off. You'll see the signal your body is sending better than any coach can tell you. Chapter 9 is the one that separates the communicators who are technically excellent from the ones rooms actually follow, and it has nothing to do with skill. The body is the signal's final container. Chapter 9 is where the signal meets its highest test, the question of whether the room trusts you enough to follow. And trust, it turns out, is built not by agreement, but by something much simpler and much rarer. Chapter 9. Make them feel safe enough to follow. Everything in this book has been building toward a problem that technique cannot solve. You can anchor perfectly, open with novelty, speak with clarity, ask the right questions, reset under pressure, regulate the room with your voice, arrive with your body fully open and your signal fully calibrated. And still, in the specific, high-stakes conversation where it matters most, the room withholds the one thing that makes following feel safe enough to do. Trust. Not trust in your competence. Most rooms will grant competence to a person who has done everything the preceding 8 chapters describe. Trust in your intention, the specific, felt sense that the person speaking is genuinely interested in the outcome for everyone in the room, not just the outcome for themselves. That their signal is not a performance of care designed to produce a desired result. That the clarity, the questions, the regulation, all of it is in service of something real rather than something strategic. This distinction is the difference between a technically excellent communicator and one the room actually follows. The technically excellent communicator produces admiration. The communicator who is both technically excellent and genuinely trustworthy produces something rarer, the specific, voluntary, uncoerced alignment of another person's direction with yours, not because you convinced them, but because following you felt safe. That is the highest available output of human communication, and it cannot be produced by technique alone. What trust actually is. Trust is not confidence in someone's competence. Competence is a prerequisite, but not the point. We trust competent people with tasks. We follow trustworthy people into uncertainty. The distinction matters enormously for communication because most communication advice is optimized for competent signals. Be clear, be specific, be well prepared, be credible. These are necessary. They establish the baseline. They tell the room, this person can do what they say. But the room that trusts you is not just saying this person can. It is saying, this person will protect my interests alongside their own, will use their competence in ways that do not require me to be managed, will tell me what is true rather than what produces the outcome they want from me. That felt sense does not come from argument. It comes from something the research calls procedural fairness, the specific experience of being treated as a participant in the conversation rather than an audience for it. The sense that your speaking time was respected, your perspective was genuinely received, your resistance was engaged with rather than managed, and the outcome of the exchange was genuinely open rather than predetermined. The room that has experienced procedural fairness does not just trust the communicator. It follows them, with the specific, voluntary quality of following that is the only kind worth having. The Harvard finding that changes everything. Harvard researchers studying negotiation, conflict resolution, and persuasion across multiple decades produced a finding that runs counter to almost every instinct most people have in high-stakes communication. You do not need to agree with someone to build trust with them. You need to give them roughly equal speaking time. Not agreement. Not validation. Not the performed warmth of someone who is trying to make the other person feel heard as a tactical step toward closing. Genuine, structural, temporal equity. The simple, radical act of allowing the other person to occupy as much of the conversation's time as you do. The research showed that participants in conversations who experienced equal speaking time reported significantly higher trust in their counterpart, even when the counterpart had disagreed with them substantially, even when no agreement was reached, even when the outcome was not what they had hoped for. The equity itself produced the trust, not the agreement. The floor. This finding is radical in its practical implication. You can disagree with someone completely, argue against their position directly and without concession, and still build trust with them. If you allow them the time to speak, receive what they say with genuine attention, and engage with their perspective before pressing your own. The communicator who interrupts, who speaks over, who fills the other person's pauses with their own resumption, who signals through timing that the other person's words are a gap to be managed rather than content to be received, destroys trust faster than any argument can rebuild it. Not because interrupting is rude, though it is, because it tells the room's mirror system, at the physiological level, your speaking time is less valuable than mine. The room hears this not as an argument to be evaluated, but as a status signal to be responded to, and it responds with the guardedness of a person who has been told, implicitly and unmistakably, that they are an audience rather than a participant. The communicator who holds their speaking time offers the floor genuinely and waits for the other person to complete before responding, with the specific, unhurried quality of someone who has actually heard what was said rather than simply waited for it to end, produces the opposite effect. The room opens, not because agreement arrived, because equity did. Taking turns versus managing turns. There is a distinction that the Harvard research implies but does not name explicitly, and it is the most important practical distinction in this chapter. Taking turns and managing turns are not the same thing. Managing turns is the behavior of the communicator who controls the conversational floor strategically, who allows the other person to speak because doing so is tactically useful, who listens with the specific quality of attention that is scanning for the opening to resume rather than genuinely receiving what is being said. This is common. It is often not consciously performed, and it is legible to the room's mirror system, which reads the quality of attention underneath the behavior rather than the behavior itself. The room that is being managed knows it is being managed. It may not be able to name what it senses. It senses it anyway, the specific, low-level alertness of a person who has been given the floor, but not the genuine attention of the person who gave it. The trust that strategic turn management is trying to produce is undermined by the specific quality of the management. Taking turns is something different. It is the genuine, non-strategic offering of the conversational floor to the other person with the authentic intention of receiving what they produce with it. It requires the specific cognitive discipline of actually listening, not constructing the response while the other person speaks, not monitoring their words for the moment your resumption is appropriate, but being fully, receptively present to what they are saying with the openness of someone who has not already decided what they think. This is harder than any technique in this book. Not because the behavior is complicated, the behavior is simply listening, but because under the conditions of a high-stakes conversation, the default mode of most human minds is response construction rather than reception. The loaded response is always more cognitively available than the genuinely open reception. Genuine listening requires the deliberate, practiced suppression of the response construction program in favor of the reception program, a cognitive discipline that, like all disciplines, is difficult at first and becomes, with practice, the specific quality of presence that rooms experience as exceptional. The ethics of influence. This book has taught you, across 9 chapters, a comprehensive system for influencing the physiological state, attention, trust, and direction of the people you communicate with. The system works. The research behind it is real. The tactics are effective. It is worth saying directly, they can be misused. A person with the full toolkit this book provides and the specific intention of extracting something from the people they communicate with, compliance, agreement, purchase, behavior, without genuine regard for those people's interests is a more sophisticated manipulator than they were before page 1. The techniques amplify whatever intention is behind them. They do not require good intention to function. This is not a reason to withhold the tools. It is a reason to be specific about what they are for. The communicator who uses these tools in service of genuine exchange, who anchors and opens and clarifies and questions and resets and regulates from the authentic intention of producing outcomes that are good for everyone in the room, not just for the person who read the book, produces something the manipulative version cannot. The room's mirror systems are sophisticated enough to read the difference between influence that serves the influencer and influence that serves the exchange. The room that trusts the former may follow temporarily. The room that trusts the latter follows durably, returns, refers, advocates, and becomes the specific kind of audience that sustains a career, a business, or a relationship across the full range of conditions that inevitably include difficulty. The toolkit is neutral. The intention behind it is not. Use these tools for what they are designed for, not the extraction of compliance, but the production of genuine exchange, the specific, ethical, trust-building communication that leaves every room better regulated, better informed, and more genuinely connected than it was before you arrived. That is the highest use of everything this book has given you. The practice, the turn audit. For 1 week, after every significant conversation, ask one question. Did I take turns, or did I manage turns? Not a judgment, a distinction. The honest answer reveals the specific conversations in which your intention is genuinely collaborative and the specific conversations in which the management impulse is running underneath the collaborative behavior. In the conversations where management is running, identify what is driving it. Usually it is one of two things: the pressure of a desired outcome that makes genuine openness feel risky, or the specific habit of response construction that practice has made automatic. For the outcome-driven management, trust the Harvard finding. The floor produces more trust than the argument. Give the floor. Receive what comes back. The outcome you want is more available to the room that trusts you than to the room that is being managed toward it. For the habit-driven management, practice the reception program. In one conversation per day for 1 week, make a deliberate commitment to fully receive before responding, to wait until the other person has completely finished, to hold the response construction program in suspension for the duration of their speaking time, and to begin your response from what you actually heard rather than from what you had prepared. The conversation that follows that practice is different in a quality that is difficult to describe and immediately recognizable to anyone who has experienced it. The specific, rare, slightly startling quality of a conversation in which both people are genuinely present at the same time. That quality is trust, produced not by argument or technique or signal management, but by the simple, radical, endlessly difficult practice of actually being in the room with the person you are talking to. Why you're losing trust in every high-stakes conversation. Harvard researchers found you don't need to agree with someone to build trust. You need to do something much simpler, and almost nobody does it in high-stakes conversations. The finding: equal speaking time builds trust faster than agreement. You can disagree completely, argue directly, reach no consensus, and still walk out of the room with more trust than you walked in with, if you genuinely gave the other person the floor. The reason: trust isn't competence. Competence makes people trust you with tasks. Trust makes people follow you into uncertainty. And the room that experiences genuine procedural fairness, that feels like a participant rather than an audience, gives you the voluntary, durable following that no amount of persuasion technique can produce. But here's the real distinction. Taking turns and managing turns are not the same thing. The room knows when it is being managed. Its mirror system reads the quality of your attention underneath the behavior. Genuine listening, the actual reception of what the other person says before your response is constructed, is rarer than any communication skill. And the room that receives it opens in a way that nothing else produces. After your next high-stakes conversation, ask one question: did I take turns or manage turns? The honest answer tells you everything about where your communication practice needs to go next. Final chapter tomorrow: the cognitive close. How to end any conversation in a way that produces action rather than ambiguity. Trust is not the reward for excellent communication. It is the condition in which communication's full power becomes available. Chapter 10 is where you use that power to close, not as an ending, but as a direction. Chapter 10, the cognitive close. Every conversation ends, most in badly. Not badly in the sense of conflict or failure, badly in the specific, costly sense of ambiguity. The conversation that was productive, engaged, well-regulated, and genuinely trusted dissolves into the standard exit ritual. Great talking. Let's follow up. I'll send that over. we should do this again. And the room disperses, having shared significant time and attention without producing the one thing that converts a good conversation into a changed outcome. A clear next action with a specific owner and a defined timeline. This is the cognitive close, not a sales technique, not a persuasion maneuver, not the aggressive, always be closing energy of someone who has read the wrong books about influence. It is the specific, respectful, trust-preserving practice of ending every significant conversation with the cognitive clarity that good intention and productive exchange almost never automatically produce. The reason they don't produce it automatically is neurological. The end of a conversation is precisely the moment when the brain's cognitive load is highest. The accumulated weight of everything discussed, the social processing of the exchange, the beginning of transition to whatever comes next. The cognitive close does not fight that load. It works with it, providing the specific, minimal, crystallizing structure that the overloaded brain can receive, retain, and act on when the alternative is forgetting everything meaningful that was said within 48 hours. The forgetting that ends careers. The research on conversation memory is brutal in its implication for everyone who believes that good meetings produce outcomes. Hermann Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve, the most replicated finding in memory research, shows that without deliberate reinforcement, people forget approximately 70% of what they were told within 24 hours and up to 90% within a week. This is not a failure of intelligence or attention or engagement. It is the normal operation of a brain that processes far more information than it stores and retains only what is rehearsed, emotionally significant, or immediately acted upon. The practical implication for communication is direct. The conversation that does not end with a clear, specific, rehearsed next action is a conversation that will be largely forgotten by tomorrow morning. The insight that felt important, the commitment that felt genuine, the direction that felt clear, gone, not through bad faith, but through the normal, merciless operation of the brain's retention architecture. The cognitive close is the specific intervention that puts something into the brain's retention system before the conversation ends, not a summary of everything discussed, which is too much and arrives too late to be processed freshly, but a single, crystallized, actionable output that the brain can tag as the thing that matters and retain with the disproportionate reliability it reserves for items that are clearly marked as consequential. The architecture of the close. The cognitive close has three components. Each is necessary. Together, they are sufficient. The crystallization. A single sentence, not a paragraph, not a summary, a sentence that names the specific output of the conversation. Not what was discussed, what was decided, agreed, or identified as the next step. The crystallization does not need to be comprehensive. It needs to be clear. So the decision is X. The thing we're taking from this is Y. What we've identified is Z. One sentence. The most important output only. Everything else can be in the notes. The crystallization serves two functions simultaneously. It tests whether genuine alignment exists. If the other person receives it without correction, alignment is confirmed. If they correct it, misalignment is surfaced before the conversation ends rather than discovered expensively after, and it gives the brain its retention anchor. The single crystallized statement, delivered at the close, is what the room will still have access to on Thursday when the details of the conversation have faded. The owner, a named, specific, individual human being who is responsible for the next action. Not, we should, the grammatical construction that kills more organizational progress than any strategic failure. Not, the team will, which is no one will in a costume. A name. Sylvia is going to. I'll. You're taking. The named owner is the specific intervention that converts collective intention into individual accountability. The difference between a conversation that produced alignment and a conversation that produced the specific, well-intentioned, costless agreement that no one acts on because everyone assumed someone else would. The timeline. A specific date or time frame attached to the action and its owner. Not soon. Not in the next little while. A date. Even an approximate one, even a deliberately chosen one that everyone in the room understands, is an estimate. By Friday, before we talk next week, in the next 2 weeks, the timeline is not primarily a planning tool. It is a cognitive anchor, the specific marker that moves the action from the abstract space of intentions into the concrete space of calendar reality, where the brain can locate it, anticipate it, and prepare for it. 3 components, 1 sentence each, 30 seconds at the end of any conversation. This is the close. Why most people avoid closing. The cognitive close is not difficult to execute. It is difficult to initiate, and understanding why is the key to initiating it consistently. Most people avoid closing conversations clearly because clarity feels presumptuous. The conversational norm in most professional and social contexts is managed vagueness, the unspoken agreement that no one will be specific enough about commitments and timelines to make non-delivery visible. Managed vagueness is comfortable for everyone in the room while the conversation is happening. It is expensive for everyone after the room disperses. The communicator who closes clearly is doing something that runs counter to this norm, naming the action, the owner, and the timeline with the specific directness that feels, to the managed vagueness reflex, like pressure. It is not pressure. It is respect, the specific respect of treating the other person as someone whose time and attention are worth converting into a clear outcome rather than a pleasant exchange that fades by morning. The way to initiate the close without triggering the managed vagueness resistance is in the framing. Not, so what are you going to do? Which is evaluative and creates pressure. Not, I just want to make sure we're aligned, which signals distrust. But before we wrap up, just so we both leave with the same picture, the thing I'm taking from this is crystallization. Does that track for you? This framing does several things simultaneously. It positions the close as shared clarity rather than accountability extraction. It offers the crystallization tentatively enough that correction feels easy rather than confrontational, and it gives the other person the genuine option of adjusting the output before the conversation ends rather than discovering the misalignment later, after they confirm or correct. And the next step is action. Is that something you're taking, or is that with me? Owner confirmed. By when do you think, or I'll plan for, timeline? Does that work? Timeline set. Done. The conversation has produced an outcome. The room leaves with a shared, retained, actionable output that is still accessible on Thursday. The close and trust. The cognitive close does one more thing that is worth naming explicitly because it connects this chapter to the one that preceded it. It is an act of trust, not in the sense of vulnerability or emotional openness, in the specific, practical sense that the communicator who closes clearly is demonstrating, through the act of the close itself, that they take the other person's commitment seriously, that they consider the outcome worth naming, that the conversation was real enough to produce a direction rather than just an exchange. The room that experiences a well-executed cognitive close, that leaves a conversation with a crystallized output, a named owner, and a defined timeline, experiences something that most conversations do not produce: the specific, satisfying sense of having been in a conversation that mattered, that the time spent was converted into something real, that the person across from them considered the outcome important enough to name. That sense builds trust faster than most trust-building behaviors. Not because the close is a trust technique, but because it is a demonstration, concrete, specific, and immediately verifiable, of the quality of intention this book has argued for across 10 chapters. The communicator who closes well is not just producing better outcomes. They are signaling, through the structure of the close itself, that outcomes are what they are there for. The room that receives that signal consistently stops treating the communicator as someone to engage with and starts treating them as someone to rely on. That is the final shift, and it comes not from a grand gesture of competence or a perfectly crafted moment of vulnerability, but from 30 seconds at the end of every conversation. The specific, simple, endlessly repeatable act of ending with clarity rather than ambiguity. The complete system. 10 chapters, 10 interventions, each addressing a different point in the signal chain that runs from the room's first perception of you to its final decision about whether to follow. The entry signals intent before you speak. The anchor opens pattern interruption before you have said anything of substance. Novelty earns the attention the content needs to land. Clarity converts complex into carried. Questions give the room a reason to be a participant rather than an audience. The pause resets under pressure. The voice regulates the room's physiological state. The body completes the signal the voice begins. Trust transforms the technically excellent communicator into the one the room voluntarily follows. And the close converts the trust, the attention, and the aligned direction into the specific, durable, actionable output that is the only reason to have the conversation in the first place. None of these interventions is independently sufficient. All of them are independently useful. Together, applied consistently across the full range of communication contexts, the meeting, the negotiation, the difficult conversation, the presentation, the relationship that is straining under the pressure of unsaid things, they produce the specific, compounding, self-reinforcing quality that the rooms you enter will eventually stop attributing to skill and start attributing to something they cannot name. They are not wrong that it is something they cannot name, but you know what it is. It is the deliberate, practiced, intentional production of every variable you can control, from the breath before you speak to the close after the last word, in service of the genuine, ethical, trust-producing exchange that leaves every room better than you found it. That is the complete system. That is what extraordinary communication actually is. Why great conversations produce no outcomes. Ebbinghaus found people forget 70% of what they were told within 24 hours. Here's the 30-second close that keeps the outcome of any conversation alive by Thursday. Most conversations end in managed vagueness, the comfortable, expensive agreement that no one will be specific enough about commitments and timelines to make non-delivery visible. The cognitive close ends that. 3 components. 1 sentence each. First, the crystallization. 1 sentence naming the specific output. Not what was discussed, what was decided. The thing I'm taking from this is X. Does that track? This tests alignment before the room disperses. Second, the owner. A named individual. Not we should, not the team will. A name. You're taking this, or I'll handle this. The difference between collective intention and individual accountability. Third, the timeline. A specific date. Not soon. By Friday. Before we talk next week. The timeline moves the action from the abstract space of intentions into the concrete space of calendar reality. 3 components. 30 seconds. The conversation produced an outcome. The communicator who closes clearly isn't applying pressure. They're demonstrating, through the structure of the close, that the outcome matters, that the room's time was real enough to name. That signal builds the specific, durable trust that no amount of warmth or competence can produce on its own. That's the complete system. 10 chapters. Use them. Afterward, the room is always reading. You will enter a room tomorrow. It will read your signal in 200 milliseconds. It will decide, before you speak, what quality of attention to give you. It will calibrate, in the first 60 seconds, how much authority to extend. It will track, throughout the conversation, whether you are a participant in the exchange or a manager of it. It will leave the conversation with a felt sense of whether following you is safe, and it will act on that felt sense, or not, in ways that are mostly invisible to conscious analysis and entirely visible in outcomes. You cannot prevent the room from reading you. You can change what it reads. That is all this book has ever been about. Go change what the room reads.